This week, the podcast hits rock bottom as we discuss two movies so bad I almost want to go back and review every WrestleMania weekend show. Let's get this over with, Brian. We are discussing tonight the 2006 movie My Super Ex-Girlfriend and the new Netflix release, Thunder Force. This is the Superhero Pantheon. On this podcast, we take one superhero film a week and decide whether it should be in the Pantheon, the pile of shame, or somewhere in between. My name is Jerome Cuson. You can find me on Twitter at JeromeC1985. You can find additional episodes of this podcast through Apple Podcast, Stitcher, Spotify, and all of your favorite podcast apps through the real world. We strongly encourage you to leave a 4 or 5-star review so as to help people discover this show and the great work that the folks at the real world are doing. If you would like to interact with us or send feedback, you can do so by following us on Twitter at Hero Pantheon. My co-host for this week and every week will be Brian DeBrain. He can be found on Twitter at Brian DeBrain. Brian, first we are going to discuss My Super Ex-Girlfriend. Brian, usually I let you talk first and kind of give your thoughts, but I'm going to go first this time because this is a movie that I recall. So I looked at my IMDb rating from 2006. I did watch this in 2006, and I gave it a 3 out of 10. I went back and watched the movie, and I think I overrated the movie because I have to say, normally when we get into some of these movies, my opinion is either better or it is about the same. This is the first time that I have watched a movie and gave it even such a low rating back in 2006. This was painful to watch. This was 1 hour and 36 minutes of my life that I will never see again. I kind of feel the same way about Thunder Force, but this movie, My Super Ex-Girlfriend, it is not only bad, but it also has a lot of very problematic elements that we are going to get into. And I am so curious to know what your ratings are going to be for this, Brian, because I am fairly certain that one of the categories doesn't even deserve to be discussed, and we can get into that. But, you know, you look at this, you've got Ivan Reitman, who is a legendary director. You've got Luke Wilson coming off of Old School, is probably at the peak of his powers at this point. Uma Thurman is coming off of Kill Bill, which is an important inflection point in her career. And you've got Anna Faris, who is, slowly becoming a bigger star. You've got Rainn Wilson just before The Office was about to take off. You've got Eddie Izzard and, what she has been able to do in her career. It is absolutely remarkable to me that none of this works.
Yeah, all I remember from this movie was the popcorn. And then once we talked about reviewing this movie, I was like, "Holy shit! I did see this movie," and I remember nothing from it. And then rewatching this movie, it was just fucking rock bottom, like fucking unbelievably bad dial. And I hate to speak ill will of the writer because the writer's passed on, and he passed on kind of young. His name is Don Payne, but he did work on Fantastic Four: Rise of the Silver Surfer and the first two Thor movies, especially Thor: The Dark World. But you kind of see his writing sensibilities from that, combined with trying to do a comedy in 2006, where he sounds like he's writing jokes from like 1992, which even then is still kind of cringe. But man, there's a lot of cringy moments, and Rainn Wilson is like maybe the worst person in the world, one of the worst people in the world in this movie, and like, yeah, it's just a lot of like negative energy and bad people, just a lot of it. And yeah, there's nothing really superhero about this. It's more, it feels like it was just kind of making fun of superheroes in general, but in the worst possible way. And then just doing a whole bunch of tropes to the point where you sent me that video where it looks like this movie totally ripped off Meteor Man. So
I figured you would enjoy that. So there really are not a lot of notes on this movie with good reason. It did not do very well at the box office. This is yet another movie that we might not have even reviewed because both of us forgot its existence. Thankfully, we did not have to waste any money renting this, as this was and still is on HBO Max. So if you really want to punish yourself, go ahead and give this a watch. So I mentioned just a couple minutes ago that we don't really have one of the categories should not exist. I think that there are no heroes in this movie, Brian. I am firmly convinced of that. You could tell me that Jenny Johnson, Uma Thurman, is a hero, and I'm going to tell you that you're a liar. I'm going to tell you that Luke Wilson and Rainn Wilson are creepy, and they are not heroes. I'm going to tell you that Eddie Izzard, she is a superhero or super villain, but she's also a terrible person. Wanda Sykes is a terrible person because she literally witnesses sexual harassment and physical violence at points, and the only reason that she fires Luke Wilson's character is because of capitalism. So there are no heroes, Brian. I'm giving this category a zero because there are no heroes because everyone in this movie is terrible, and for that reason, I cannot justify giving this any score.
well, I didn't think it would go that low, but in my interpretation of the movie, it seems like Luke Wilson is the protagonist, not necessarily a hero, but he's the protagonist of the movie, and everyone and with Thurman is our G girl is definitely a villain. But the way that they kind of want you to think that that they're heroes, but they're definitely not. Like there's no redeemable qualities about these people. Even Luke Wilson's character, who's just trying, even though like he just wanted to get laid apparently, and then he just hooked up with the wrong girl at the wrong time, and then she gets attached, and there you go. So very problematic stuff. So I'm gonna give it a one, just because I kind of have that rule about not giving zeros, but I've probably broke that rule a couple times. But for this, I'll give it a one, and I'll consider Luke Wilson the lone hero in this movie.
All right, let's get to the villains. This is where we're actually going to talk about all the characters because in my view, everyone in this movie is a villain in some way. So we have Uma Thurman as Jenny Johnson, and Uma Thurman as Jenny Johnson, she is a bad person who is very selfish throughout. She plays the role of a superhero, but when you look at some of the individual actions of this movie, they do show her saving people at times, but for the most part, on an individual basis, she is a terrible, terrible person. And the thing that I was thinking about, and I've been thinking about this for a couple reasons, is I always think back to to Christopher Reeve's performance in the 1978 Superman and how that movie comes across. And I couldn't help but think if they and I don't think that Uma Thurman can necessarily play this. Maybe she can, but I almost think that this is the kind of movie, especially because it is a romantic comedy, that this almost like if they had reversed the genders and played this off like more of a 1978 Superman movie, it would have come off so much better with Jenny Johnson in the Superman role and kind of playing this Christopher Reeve like character. Because, I mean, that character arguably is kind of a creep at moments, but Christopher Reeve is genuinely one of the most charming guys in the world, and just the way that he plays it is so great. And I watched the Muppet Show episode that he hosted, and that's another reason that Christopher Reeve has been on my mind because I recently watched that. But Uma Thurman is not given anything to play here, and I think part of the issue is it's funny that she ends up with a brown wig again, just like in Batman and Robin when she was Poison Ivy. Kissing becomes an important plot point, just like when she was Poison Ivy in Batman and Robin. She also makes some very unusual decisions. There is a point when, like, after 2 dates, she basically reveals her identity to Matt out of nowhere and then swears him to secrecy, even though there's no reason to think they're actually in love. But apparently has attachment issues. She becomes a stalker and yells at a little girl for how she crosses the street. Just very selfish throughout. And the thing that was always on my mind, Brian, is like, why would she be a hero given the way that she acts? There's nobody saying in her ear, great power equals great responsibility. And there is also a point when she and Luke Wilson are apparently making coitus in the air when she's flying him around, and her partner stops consenting to the sex in the sky, but she doesn't stop. She slut shames Hannah. She tries killing goldfish and does a lot of property damage for no reason. She messes with Matt's very important work presentation for no other reason and strips him naked. These are all things that Jenny Johnson does. She is a terrible person.
Yeah, there's nothing. I mean, there's nothing else to say about that because like that's exactly what it is. Like, I can't believe like he wrote a character like this. And just like those tropes about the crazy ex-girlfriend and all that bullshit. Just like, wow, he just went all out and then had no redeeming qualities whatsoever. And even in the origin story, they didn't show you anything about her having this conscious decision to be a good person and be this hero. It just jumps to her being a hero, and then she's like, "Oh, why do I got to save the city again?" And then it's just like, and then there's a scene with a rocket coming, and then it's about to hit New York City, and everyone's panicking, and Luke Wilson's like, "You should do something," and it's like, "Why should I do something?" It's like, okay, so all of a sudden you get a boyfriend, all of a sudden you just stop being the person you were and become this other person all of a sudden. Man, it was just terrible writing. Oh my god, just terrible writing, and I can't believe Uma Thurman kind of went with it, but it is what it is. Hopefully she got paid for this crap.
I think there is a way to do this movie that where it is interesting and where she is getting tired of saving the city. Like I could see a hypothetical where you could do that, but you can't do that in this way where it's trying to be this very broad comedy and the humor is very broad throughout, and there's such a lack of specificity, and I think a lot of the issues come down to the script because while I don't think Uma Thurman is very good in this movie, I think a lot of the issues pertain to her character, and I'm much less critiquing Uma Thurman's performance than I am the sexist writing that is taking place, and that's ultimately what bothers me about the Jenny Johnson character. Is we are still in 2021 at a point where there are not a lot of female superhero movies. Technically, we are talking about two of them today. Both of these movies written and directed by men. And I think that is a huge issue is you can have these very good female superhero movies, but I think it's becoming increasingly obvious to me anyway that you want to have females behind the camera writing the scripts because I think it just works out that way. And there are certainly exceptions to the rule. I don't think Wonder Woman 1984 is very good, even though Patty Jenkins is the writer and the director. But at least, at least even in that movie, it just doesn't feel like Wonder Woman is as terrible of a character, even though there are also consent issues in that movie. But it's just very frustrating. So, as terrible as Jenny Johnson is, Matt Saunders as Luke Wilson might be even worse. He creeps on Jenny on a train on public transportation, which is seems like a major break of etiquette. Brian, I know that you are also someone who uses public transportation. Would you ever creepily talk to a woman the way that he does on this train?
Doesn't work like that, man. Does not work like that. It usually happens where you sit down and some accent kind of happens, and then you start randomly talking to girls on the public bus or whatever like that. That's the creepy way to do it nowadays. In 2006, it probably didn't seem as creepy when you're writing it down, but it's definitely one of those things where it's like a lot of women on the bus or the train just do not want to be harassed and try to be, picked up on. They just want to go home, and I get that. And I've definitely seen those situations, and I almost fucking had to stand up and say something, but luckily these creeps just kind of stopped. But I've seen that situation. Believe me, I've seen it.
So we also have Matt Saunders talks very creepily about women. He literally sexually harasses Hannah in their second scene together by looking up her skirt. He makes a crying game reference and is generally just a complete doofus. So I mentioned the fact that he sexually harasses Hannah. He also shoves Hannah down at one point for no reason because Jenny is just staring at them. And maybe he did fear for her, but there is a better way than doing that. It's also really amusing to me, not because the movie's good. He should have been fired twice, but the reason that he gets fired is for something that is not even his fault, because of what G-Girl does. And that is, I mean, that almost feels accurate to me, Brian. The fact that he doesn't get fired for physically or sexually harassing somebody, but he gets fired for losing an account. That is capitalism at its best.
Yeah, and Well, I originally thought like he got fired because he was naked in the meeting, but I guess you could interpret it that way too. Just yeah, I don't know what Juan Sykes was doing in this movie, but like it could have been anybody in that role, and it just happened to be Wanda Sykes, and they I don't know. It was just kind of weird casting because like not a lot of people of color in this movie, and she's like one of the few, if only, and she's just kind of there to have weird office authority, but not really have any character development. So really disappointing there too.
All right, let's talk about Rainn Wilson. He might legitimately be the worst person in this movie. I don't know. I mean, Matt Saunders also gaslights both Hannah and Jenny at one point towards the end of the movie by gaslighting Jenny into thinking that he's in love with her only so that he could take her powers away, and then doesn't tell Hannah about what Jenny's doing. So he's also gaslighting. But the way that Rainn Wilson talks about women in this movie, like this is the type of person who would be a member of QAnon or 8chan in the year of our Lord 2021. That's how he comes across. And I don't even want to get into some of the specifics, but I mean, he is leering at women. He is talking about, he is objectifying them, sexualizing them constantly. This is not the person that I would want as my best friend. If this was somebody who was even in my sphere, I would not be talking to them. Even in 2006, I think I would have the good sense to not talk to this character. He is just an abomination of a human being.
Very tropey. It's just one of those things in like comedies where you have like the horny horn dog best friend who's just like disrespectful to women, but then somehow gets a girl at the end, and exactly that's what happens in the end of this movie, where Rainn Wilson is like nonstop, not like bothering this fucking bartender, and like just like casually starts talking to her at the end because she's impressed that he's associated with G Girl. So there you go. If you're associated with G Girl, you can win the girl that you've been annoying for the last several months at a bar. Apparently, that's the thinking. So yeah, it's just pretty terrible. I'm glad we kind of broke away from some of these tropes, but you can kind of see some of it still in some of the modern movies. But yeah, again, just more tropey stuff, kind of making fun of the genre of superheroes. I mean, what it was in 2006, but still. And then you got this guy just being a douchebag and like, I don't know. I was just shocked that all this stuff was recorded and like on film, and they just released it, man.
So back in 2006, so Eddie Izzard, since this movie has come out, she now identifies as a woman, and she, her, those are her chosen pronouns. So it's tough to talk about this because in this movie, Eddie Izzard is playing a kind of a crazy ex-boyfriend who is also a major creep and wants to create. It seems like she wants to recreate her superhero ness, and Eddie Izzard's character also does some major league stalking. The ex-boyfriend also has a shrine built for Jenny, and apparently, because of this, they are perfect for each other.
I don't know. They didn't really show what kind of the attraction was between the two, other than they were like rejects in high school, and then all of a sudden Jenny gets the powers and becomes popular, and then he's like, "Oh, you're so popular now, and you left me behind," and blah blah blah. And then as adults, they just grew into kind of these creepy people that are just obsessive, and yeah, maybe they are meant for each other because they're just really creepy, obsessive people that knew each other from high school and got back together. I don't know. It's just really weird writing because like you figured like he's like the Lex Luthor of the movie and he's gonna do something evil and blah blah blah, and all he does is just take away her powers really, and then gives her back the powers on accident, which was even more stupid because they didn't even explain where they got the rock from or like the science behind the rock. It's just it's just this meteor, you know. Again, Meteor Man connection. Again, Meteor Man. So there you go. It's basically the Meteor Man plot taken into a romantic comedy.
Except Jenny Johnston is not losing her powers. I think that is what is so fascinating about this, and I think that Eddie Izzard's character is bad, and we also have Wanda Sykes, who again witnesses sexual harassment as well as physical violence later on, does nothing about either incident, and is treated as a bad person and kind of the butt of a joke for seemingly wanting to report harassment. And you also have Anna Faris as Hannah, who is okay with being sexually harassed, flirts and licks the finger of a fucking coworker, which is really weird. The ending is preposterous. We'll talk more about that, but yeah, Wanda Sykes and Anna Faris do not add a whole lot to this movie. I like Eddie Izzard. I think she has done some very good work in the past. I like some of her comedic sensibilities, but this movie is just a terrible use of literally everyone. I'm giving this a 3, and I think that's being very generous.
I'm going with a one because just everyone is just bad, but like not a really true, well-written villain. It's just bad characters all around, and that's kind of sad. But um, yeah, I'm gonna go with the full-out one with this one because in my eyes, Luke Wilson is the protagonist. Jenny's the kind of the villain, and also the villain is Eddie Izzard's character. But like, still, it feels like with all that talent, it's just the shitty writing that just kind of messes everything up. So.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly can't argue with that logic. Let's talk about the story. This is an incredibly problematic story. So Jenny and Matt get together, even though they're clearly not right for one another, and there is also a lot of BS surrounding their relationship and even what goes on with Matt and Hannah. Matt apparently attracts crazy women, and that is literally how they are referred to, including Jenny. And it's just when you talk about the tropes, that's one of the worst. Is this idea of a woman being crazy, and that's literally how they are being defined, and that's just not how things work. And he is also in a will they or won't they with Hannah. But what's also interesting is that they explore this idea of the crazy woman, even though Matt and Rainn Wilson's character are very. There's a lot of toxic masculinity oozing from them, and yet that is not challenged, and I think that is hugely problematic. And you've also got Professor Bedlam, who is played by Eddie Izzard. Professor Bedlam is trying to figure out what makes Jenny hero and stalks her throughout. Jenny is portrayed as being very jealous and needy. The ending of this movie is also fucking preposterous, as Hannah is given powers, and then Hannah and Jenny become kind of a superhero duo, but they also bring Dr. or Professor Bedlam and Jenny together, and they end up as a couple. But the thing that's so weird to me is one of the ways that we know that they are superheroes is they change the hair color of the women, and for Uma Thurman, she goes from a brunette to her natural blonde color, but Anna Faris goes from blonde to red, and it just feels like very like the Uma Thurman thing was kind of sexist because they also show her breasts growing, but there's like not even internal consistency because the idea that they seem to be trying to get across is that because she's a superhero, she is quote unquote more physically attractive, but also more confident. And the Hannah thing doesn't make sense.
Yeah, that whole ending was just fucking ridiculous, man. Like I mentioned, they don't even mention where this meteorite comes from and the logics behind it. All you have to do is touch it, and then it takes your powers away. And then if you touch it again, it explodes and gives you powers. Like it was just fucking weird and like ridiculous, and the logic behind it made no sense. The hair thing was like, oh, that's cute, but then it was just like, wait, what was the logic behind that? So yeah, just very very questionable writing, and just like a lot of just stuff that it just seems like they just took a bunch of tropes and made an outline of a bunch of tropes and then just put all this romantic comedy stuff in between that just doesn't work at all. And then you get the problematic writing with the characters, and then the story is just ridiculous. Like at one point she throws a shark into his bedroom, right? But like shouldn't the shark not even be moving? Like it should be dead at that point. So it's moving around as if it's still alive and trying to eat on in his apartment, and then it just flies out the window, and we never even see the shark hit the floor, which is you gotta imagine a floor like a shark hitting the ground from like that height, it would have just exploded everywhere. So there's no consequences and stuff like that with G Girl doing this shit. It's very weird stuff. Very weird stuff.
I'm giving this a 2.
I'm gonna go with just a one again because like man, it's just I couldn't believe some of the stuff they put in this movie, and thinking that they were gonna make it funny and oh this is gonna look cool, and it just doesn't. It's so flat. It's so flat.
All right, let's get into the technical aspects of this movie because I know that you are a big costume person and you also like to talk about the score. But the scene that I want to focus on is this transition of Jenny from a quote unquote regular human to a hero. And I mean, it's just one of the most sexist and awful things that I've ever seen. It basically pulls that she's all that. That's how it comes across to me. I don't know if you agree with that sentiment.
I mean, that's kind of the general feeling now. I mean, it's been done in movies before, but Cheezel That has become like the not the cliche, but like the one that comes to mind the most because she's going down the stairs, right? Like I remember watching that movie as a kid, and then watching other '80s movies beyond that. And it's like, oh, okay, it's like this thing where like the girl is nerdy, and then all of a sudden she's like, you know, wanted again or like wanted. It's the same thing from Wonder Woman '84 with Cheetah. It just was just like weird and like all of a sudden she's got confidence from powers and like yeah, it was just weird because I don't think it was supposed to affect the confidence. It's supposed to affect the physical nature. And I don't know if it's like a hormone thing or whatever, but just weird science behind the logic.
All right, let's talk about some of the other technical aspects. So I read this. Apparently, Jenny has different costume because she's a woman, and I swear to God, that's true. And I don't even know what else to say about that.
Hey man, I didn't even notice that at first, but then when I looked at the notes, I was like, oh yeah, they just changed different colors here and there, but they didn't even emphasize that. Like they could have had some creative stuff with like the costumes and stuff and background, but they didn't do that. They just put it out there and just focused on like her being crazy and not the actual heroics of it all.
All right, let's talk about some of the effects, which are not terrible. They look okay, I would say. How do you feel about the score? I think the score feels very generic and almost like it's out of a different movie at times. And it's kind of jaunty, but it's also trying to be an epic superhero track, and it just doesn't work.
Yeah, and the soundtrack feels like '90s, like even maybe late '80s, just like this weird like a family comedy kind of soundtrack, but mixed with like superhero elements to it. Because I think the vibe they were going for was like a family feel to it or something. Because like it had like some light tones to it, but it just doesn't work with the the tone they were going for. And then like the effects were okay. It's just well, one of the things I did notice is that this may be one of the first movies I think where a person's flying and they show the person G girl like breaking the sound barrier around them. Did you notice that? I think that was just me, but I was like, oh, that's the thing they did like later in the Superman movies because I was like, oh, they actually thought of something random, but maybe that was just like a tech guy in the background, visual effects guy thinking, oh, this is the way it should look like, and it's animated, and no one even noticed or cared. But little things like that I did appreciate. But yeah, the soundtrack's bad. Colors are okay. Like the colors are not that bad, especially like what is this New York during the day? I think it was the fall because like the ending has like a nice fall leaf kind of look to it with the end with the car outside and stuff like that, and very kind of tropey where you end a movie in New York and you see the apartment buildings and that kind of thing, and it's that looked nice, but other than that, it was just very basic. So I'll stick with like a two only because I was impressed with the fact that they showed a break in the sound barrier.
I will also go with a two as well. And this at least feels representative of the city that they are supposed to be in, which I cannot say about Thunder Force. Let's get to the legacy of this movie. Again, this is very forgettable. This is not something that really had an impact on anything. This is a late stage Ivan Reitman movie, and that means that it's not very good. And it's really unfortunate to me because Ivan Reitman is the type of person who has had a legendary career and who has produced a lot of movies. He's also directed some legendary comedies. But what this movie really reinforces to me is just how important the writing is, and the writing and the script being as bad as it was. No director worth their salt is going to be able to turn this into anything worthwhile. And I feel fairly confident in just looking at the careers and how some of their careers have not developed. And, Luke Wilson, I mean, he's on Stargirl, but he hasn't really had like a big movie career. Uma Thurman, I think, has also struggled, which is unfortunate because I've really liked her in a lot of things. But it looks like both of the superhero movies she's in are going into the pile of shame. I'm giving the legacy score a two.
Yeah, it's really unfortunate because I like Ivan Reitman's work a lot. Like he did, of course, Ghostbusters 1 and 2, but like I like Kindergarten Cop a lot, and I kind of discovered that later in my life, and I was just like, wow, the writing in this is really. I mean, he didn't write it obviously, but he did have a lot with the directing and the characters and with the kids in that, and he's done like Dave and Junior. And I think Junior's underrated because I think Arnold Schwarzenegger like is really funny in that and doesn't get the credit he deserves for that one. But like he's done a lot of great work, but it just feels like late in the game, it's just like out of place and out of time, the wrong kind of comedy director for the wrong time. And in 2006, man, like up to that point, I think Evolution, which is still like so hard to find nowadays. It's remember David Duchovny fighting aliens. I think Orlando Bloom was in it. I think Julianne Moore was in it. I may be wrong on Julianne Moore on that one, but still, like it was just like a fun sci-fi movie, and to go from that to this, it feels like this kind of like ended his run of like successful movies. Because then he would go on to do Draft Day years later, and from what I've heard, Draft Day is like a fine sports movie, and Chadwick Boseman does a good job, and Kevin Costner does a good job. But considering this, it's just like it's a shame because Uma Thurman the year before in 2005 was like on a hot streak because of what happened with Kill Bill. Like Kill Bill was 2004. In 2005 she did three like good box office movies. Like Be Cool was a hit, Prime was a hit, and The Producers was like sort of a not really a box office hit, but it was like an awards hit. And then that's like if you look at her like filmography, that's her biggest like year, 2005, because of the success of Kill Bill. After My Super Ex Girlfriend, it just goes downhill from there, and I feel bad, and it sucks. But I think this kind of movie like just kind of like curtailed her career after this because it just made it not seem like she's a star player, even though the year before she had a star year. So it was just kind of weird, like a movie like this can kind of like not, turn things around in the wrong way. So overall, I think the legacy is about a one because everyone forgot about this movie. I had to remind some people about this movie, and Uma Thurman's career kind of took a downturn after this movie. And Luke Wilson, like you mentioned, they probably just picked him because he was in Old School, and that was like 3 years before, and that was a big hit, and that was a big comedy hit. So they were just kind of putting some pieces together to hopefully have a hit, and it just didn't work. So it's kind of unfortunate.
All right, so my total score is a 9, and yours?
6.
So that means that unfortunately my super ex-girlfriend will join such classics as Catwoman and Batman and Robin, among other movies, and it is going into the pile of shame. And really, I think this deserves it. As bad as this movie is, I think the thing that really bothers me is just the number of problematic elements. That's for me what pushes this over the edge. It's one thing to be bad. We've certainly talked about bad movies before with Punisher and Captain America 1990, but this movie I think crosses the line and goes into very problematic territory. So this absolutely deserves to be in the pile of shame, and I did not think that it was going to go into the pile of shame, but here we are, Brian. It indeed has gone in, and I think it's well deserved. Any final thoughts? We are not doing burning questions. Do you have any final thoughts on my super ex girlfriend?
Well, I guess now I want to watch Draft Day, all things considered, with Chadwick Boseman, and like I've heard good things about that. I remember my uncles telling me like, "Oh, you should watch it. It's like a good sports movie." And my uncles have seen all the old sports movies from like the 70s and 80s and 90s, so I kind of take that to heart. And with this, I kind of feel like, man, how did he go from all the good stuff to this? And then you kind of see where he kind of tries to make a comeback with Draft Day. So that, if anything, the silver lining, I might watch Draft Day. I don't know if it's on Disney Plus yet or still, but I'll probably check that out just because of this. So if there's any silver lining, there's that.
All right, let's talk about Thunder Force. So this is a movie. This is a Netflix release. It is directed by Ben Falcone, and Ben Falcone has a bit of a reputation for directing pretty awful comedies in recent years, and the reason that he is able to do so is because of his wife. His wife, Melissa McCarthy, has become a pretty big movie star, and the thing that's I think really important to emphasize is that Melissa McCarthy has done some very good work. I think the supporting turn that she took in Bridesmaids, I think it's one of the best comedic performances that there has been this century. I think about some of the underrated work that she has done. The movie Spy. I think she's very good in that. I think she's also very good in The Heat with Sandra Bullock. And she got an Oscar nomination for the movie Can You Ever Forgive Me? So she has been in a lot of very, very good movies. Unfortunately, I think Melissa McCarthy has also been in some really bad movies. And the majority of those bad movies, including Tammy, including this, they have been directed by her husband. And there have been a number of articles that have been posted recently, and Look, I'm not going to sit here and pretend to know what their relationship is like, but from a professional standpoint, it comes across like she is hurting her own career in trying to build up his as a director, because this is meant to be an action comedy. The problem is this movie is neither funny and the action sucks, and it's really unfortunate. And that's the Melissa McCarthy angle. Octavia Spencer is also someone who I think is a genuinely good performer. She has done some very, very good work. But then she gets stuck in movies like Ma, which Ma isn't terrible, but it just feels like kind of a waste of her skills. She was also in the most recent version of The Witches that was directed by Robert Zemeckis. And again, that's a movie that she is good in, but the movie is terrible. And these two performers, Octavia Spencer and Melissa McCarthy, for me, I think they're doing their best. And I think in some ways, I think they have good chemistry together. And I like the idea behind this movie. Unfortunately, the execution is just awful. As I mentioned, this is an action comedy that is neither funny and the comedy sucks.
Yeah, it feels like what Melissa McCarthy's trying to do in this role is very much like Chris Farley, like going in there, trying to shake things up and be funny with the dialogue you're given. It's a really terrible script, so you're gonna go in there and do some physical comedy. She's very much doing the Chris Farley in this movie, and like she's trying, but it doesn't really connect. And I feel like Octavia Spencer feels so like lost in this movie, like she's so out of place. The chemistry's there for them to do comedy, but it feels like the real movie is like if you take out the superhero aspect of the movie and just make it about these two characters and their relationship and a comedy about that, that's a much better movie to work with than this superhero shit that's going on in the background that comes to the foreground at the end. But like the stuff that's passable and palpable is like the earlier parts of the movie where they're like getting to know each other again and reacquainting each other because they had a fallout in high school. So there's that story going on, and the stuff with the grandma's interesting. But then the superhero stuff just gets so ridiculous when you throw it in there, and it's like I know, like my super ex girlfriend, we just put that in the pile of shame, but it felt like that flowed better than watching this, which is I know sounds nuts, but at one point I thought it was like, there's got to be like 30 minutes left in this movie, and I checked the time, and it's like, God, I got like another 45 to 50 minutes left in this movie, and it was just not flowing well for me at all. And yeah, and it was just so weird, like some of the choices and like some of the plot devices of this movie. It's just like, okay, so this meteor comes down, gives only sociopaths superpowers. Like what? And then you got Jason Bateman as a crab guy who didn't even get struck by the meteor. He just got bitten by a radioactive crab. So we're dealing with that kind of shit in this movie. It's like we're making fun of the genre, we're making fun of superheroes, but like tongue in cheek wise and trying to. They didn't even like do anything to kind of respect the genre. It feels like it just kind of just made fun of everything, including like the villains, everything, and like the tropey stuff about villains. Like Bobby Cannavale is just like taking a paycheck in this one, straight up. Like, yeah, he's even trying harder than he is in the Ant-Man movies, but still, like, I think he has more fun making those movies than he probably had fun making this one. You know what I mean? Like, it just seems like everything was casted well, but this script is just like not worthy of the cast at all.
What's genuinely funny to me is that Melissa Leo is also in this movie, and she's also someone who has been in very good movies, and she's a former member of the CIA, and it is incredibly obvious that there's going to be a heel turn involving her just based on her behavior, and of course that's exactly what happened. But she has this line of dialogue where she says she's bored at one point, and I was like, that is the most accurate and well written piece of dialogue that is in this movie, because at that point I was also very bored, and I think that this movie speaks to problems that a lot of modern comedies have, in that I don't think a lot of modern comedies have discipline, because you look at a movie like Ghostbusters. I am sure that there were some points of that movie that were improvised. But when you look at the script of Ghostbusters and how tight that movie is, it works because of the discipline that is involved. And it feels like Judd Apatow is responsible for letting the camera run, just letting the performers go, And sometimes I think it can lead to funny moments, but I think it also can take away from the movie that they're going for. And that's what it feels like. There are so many of those moments. I think that there are so many scenes that could have been cut down. And there is an art to editing. I don't think it's just a matter of cutting 20 minutes from the movie. I think it's just about the way that improv is done in a lot of modern comedies that just it doesn't work. And I think you see that throughout. And I'm not saying that this movie is 100% better, but I think it would have just flowed a lot better. And there are just a lot of those extra moments in scenes that add up. And it's just very frustrating. And Brian, I also have to be honest in saying that the geographic errors of Chicago also bothered me. The way that the trains look, they do not look like that. The at one point, the bus that so there's a point when Melissa McCarthy's character Lydia throws a bus and misses the supervillains, and it's not treated like a big deal. It's like a 2 minute scene, and it's the 88 bus, and the 88 bus does not go anywhere near there. They also refer to Grant Street. There is no such thing as Grant Street. There's a Grant Park, but there's no Grant Street in Chicago. And the thing that bothers me is apparently Melissa McCarthy and Ben Falcone have some roots in Chicago, and it just feels like the things that they do to represent Chicago are these very like stereotypical things. Like Lydia's character has a Chicago Bears Jim McMahon phone cover. She's wearing a Chicago Blackhawks hat. This is an era that I think you kind of have to be a nerd to understand. But she talks about having Bulls tickets at one point. But she also talks. There's also a news report that says the Cubs and White Sox weekend games are being delayed. They don't really play in the same season together unless it's October and baseball playoffs are going on. So that's weird. It's very unclear to me when this movie is taking place. And in addition to everything else, that's also what bothered me about this movie.
Listen, I get they're trying to do like funny 80s references with like the Jim McMahon stuff and like the Super Bowl shuffle stuff, but I feel like that was like jokes about that or making reference to those that era. Like those were jokes from 15 years ago, right? You know what I mean? Now, I don't think like people like 20 and under know any of that. Like, and then when they did the Glenn Fry joke, yeah, I laughed my ass off because I know who Glenn Fry is and I'm an Eagles fan, not the team, but the band. And Glenn Fry is a big part of that. Or it's Glenn Frey. I'm sorry, I should say Frey, not Fry. But they make a joke about that and how it's like their hype music and like, yeah, this works if your like target audience is like 40 and over and you're doing like 40 and over stuff, but you're doing like this general audience comedy and like, dude, 15-year-olds watching this movie are not going to know who the hell Glenn Frey is. And then they're going to just hear the song and be like, oh, that's just an 80s song. But like some of the choices in this movie for like the soundtrack, like I get what they were doing. They were trying to have a hip soundtrack because it's like you got to have hip songs with like a superhero movie. But then it's just kind of like a juxtaposition. It's like it doesn't fit because the comedy is like hit or miss, so miss more than hit. And then you got these awkward dead moments, and then you put the music behind it. It just doesn't really work well, especially with like the music choices. And then also one thing I did note is that at one point both of them are singing "Kiss from a Rose," which means that in their universe, Batman Forever exists.
So it's funny you mentioned that. So the meteor hits Chicago. There is no other world apparently outside of Chicago. My understanding is that there are only supervillains in Chicago, right?
That's what I was thinking too. But then the logic in this movie, with even with the crab, had nothing to do with the meteor. So
And you are telling me that Emily is the only person that is working on trying to take care of these supervillains. Okay, so let's go with the idea that Chicago is the only place that there are supervillains. You are telling me that if these supervillains were attacking the city, that there would be no other people doing the research. And so they mentioned that there are miscreants, and then there's like three of them, and one of them, played by Jason Bateman, isn't really a part of that. And the other thing is, so they mentioned that this meteor hits. So you've got Bobby Cannavale and you've got Palm Clementoff, most famously Mantis from Guardians of the Galaxy. So presumably they were children. would their brains be developed enough to know that they're sociopaths?
Yeah, that's where it gets kind of wonky. Like, how does like I don't know. How does a meteor know who is a sociopath or not? There's like, it's just so weird because then you get into these weird details of it all. Like you can argue like the super soldier serum has this really weird conundrum too, where it's like it enhances the evilness in a person and it enhances the goodness in a person. That's what they were, I think, trying to go for here. But the fact that they laid it out so explicit, like, oh, it's only sociopath, is like that's so specific. Like how would like radioactive energy from a meteor know whether or not a person is a sociopath and then just decide to give him power? It's fucking ridiculous. And wouldn't there be more than three people with superpowers? You know what I mean? Like, and what happened to that person at the beginning who was like running with the speed of light and destroyed that train? We never even saw that person. Like, there was no like. I was thinking like, oh, good writing would reveal that that person is like Bobby Cannavale from the beginning when he was a kid or something, and then it's like, oh, now we want to get revenge for killing my parents. None of that at all. And it was just like kind of like missed opportunities and just like, well, shouldn't it connect like this? And then, and then your brain starts thinking like, well, I guess that just they didn't really want to focus on any of that and have good writing or anything and callbacks or anything like that and full circle, all that stuff. They just didn't care.
And I think Thunder Force is generally portrayed as being very bad at their jobs, and that's also really strange to me that you would build these two characters up, and it feels like the way that their relationship is portrayed, it kind of goes back and forth about whether they like each other or not. And I think there is an interesting movie to be made about these two characters. And something else that I want to point out to you, Brian, is the casting director for this movie is Allison Jones. Do you know who Allison Jones is?
No, but she did seem to have a good grasp of casting in this movie, and especially with the flashbacks from earlier, because the young Melissa McCarthy was pretty like on point. I'll give it that.
So Allison Jones is a legendary, and when I say legendary, I'm going to run down some of the shows that she has casted over the years. And there are certainly some that are not good, but there are also there's some iconic choices here. The Good Place is a show that she had something to do with. She was also the casting director for the movie Lady Bird, which I would argue is one of the best young casts in recent years. She was also the casting director for Veep, which is why Kevin Dunn is in this movie. And on a side note, I think Kevin Dunn, who plays the diner owner, he might be the best performance in this movie because he is actually from Chicago and he's got the right accent for it too.
Yeah, I was waiting for you to make a reference to Kevin Dunn because, I mean, yeah, he's like a bit player from our past, but still, like every time he does like these small parts, he kind of elevates the role a little bit, elevates the movie a little bit. I don't know what it is. He's just got this presence, and he's just one of those character actors. You know what I mean? And he does a good job whatever he has to do, and he delivered like it felt like he delivered the only sense of like like, man, I'm a part of this city and I'm really concerned kind of vibe. And he's like the only concerned citizen, it feels like. So I don't know. Because when he's in the diner, like you hear him talk, it feels like he's really talking. You know what I mean? But that's because he's from Chicago. So
And Allison Jones is probably best known. She is the one who is the casting director for Freaks and Geeks, which, I mean, put that cast on a mantle. That is a Hall of Fame level cast. I mean, just for Jason Segel, James Franco, and Seth Rogen alone. That's not even getting into Linda Cardellini and Busy Phillips. I mean, just an incredible cast. Just that is a Pantheon level cast that she and Judd Apatow and Paul Feig put together, and I give them a ton of credit for being able to do that. And so she is a very good casting director, and I think she did a really good job of casting the younger versions of Emily and Lydia. And honestly, the first scene in this movie might have actually been my favorite one. Just the way that they became friends, I thought it was touching, and I actually liked that scene. And I almost wish that was what the movie was about, and that it wasn't a superhero movie.
that's exactly my thought. Like that, especially like if you got a good like young Melissa McCarthy to fit that role, and she did a hell of a job. I can't even find her name as the young Melissa McCarthy, but she did a hell of a job. And I felt like you could have done that as like the first act of the movie, and then break away to those two, like rebuilding that relationship later on. And you could still do a comedy, but they wanted to do a superhero action comedy, so it's just very very weird. But again, I don't know if it just fits into 2021 with this kind of style of movie because like it feels like they were just like not caring about any of like the real true superhero aspects of a movie and stuff. They're just going for more comedy, and it feels like they were just throwing Melissa McCarthy out there for these like bits and just like we need to fill time, so just kind of go out there and do your thing, and that's what it kind of felt like at times. But she's good at that, and it felt like the stuff that I was laughing at is more of like the SNL style of skits, like it was written like more like a skit, like the stuff that with the crab and her having dinner, the Crab King, or not the Crab King, but Jason Bateman as the crab. That stuff was good because it felt like I was watching a comedy skit. And if you just isolate that scene to like a 5 minute skit, it's funny. But if you put that scene in the whole movie, it's like I don't know if this works as a scene in a movie when you're trying to do this comedy with a crab guy and a superhero, but it only works in like small doses and that scene was stretched, like it was really stretched out. So yeah, they tried, but God bless Jason Bateman, man, because he just seemed like he was like doing a favor for his friends or something. Because that dude had to wear crab arms the whole movie, so good for him.
And they looked really janky too. They didn't even look good.
Yeah, but then I don't know what are real life crab arms supposed to look like? Because then when they snapped them off, I guess he grew them back. Was that the implication? Because I thought that's not how it works.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I was. Yeah, this movie's not good, and you should not watch it. And we may come back and just give scores very quickly and do that at some point. But this movie has less than 25% on Rotten Tomatoes, so this movie will very quickly be forgotten. But what we have not forgotten to do, Brian, is next week we have referenced this movie a number of times. We are finally going to give it a score, and we are going to determine whether it goes into the pile of shame, whether it goes in the Pantheon, somewhere in between. Speaking of Jason Bateman, we are finally discussing Hancock next week.
Yeah, and I really haven't seen this movie since the theaters, but I do remember being like some good twists and turns that they didn't obviously put in the advertising and the marketing, which is good because like that's some good, marketing, which you're supposed to do. But sometimes these movies nowadays give a lot away. But I like the fact that they covered. Spoiler alert. Okay, it's been like 13 years, but Charlize Theron has powers, and they did not reveal that. So that was like one of the cool parts of the movie. Other than that, I don't know if I'm a fan of the Hancock character in general, but we'll see.
Yeah, for sure. And then, so after next week, we're going to be spending the next 3 weeks on TV. Just to kind of give everybody a heads up, we are going to be discussing Falcon and the Winter Soldier in 2 weeks because the last episode is going to air, and then we'll record. Then in 3 weeks, we're going to discuss Invincible, which Brian has not yet started, but which I am a very, very big fan of. And then in 3 weeks, there is a Netflix show that we are going to be discussing that is called Jupiter. Let me double check and see what it's called here. Jupiter's Legacy. We are going to be discussing that show in the next month as well. So we're going to be spending a lot of time talking about TV, Brian. So that will be very interesting as we go into May of 2021 because we do not have an MCU movie until July to talk about. And before we go on break, we will also be discussing League of Extraordinary Gentlemen. But we are coming very close to the end of any other superhero movies besides what's currently coming out.
Yeah, and that kind of speaks to what we've been kind of talking about over the last couple of years about how these movies can actually be better as shows, and we're actually seeing that now, where it feels like a lot of these, I don't know if Jupiter Ascending is like, is it a show or is that a movie? Like, may have read both, but still, like, it feels like we're going more to the TV era. You know what I mean? And we've been talking about that the last couple of years on the podcast, where it feels like you can do better and tell better stories over several episodes. So that's kind of where we've been going, and it's kind of like an evolution. So it's kind of awesome to see, the media and streaming kind of reflect that, and now we're getting more superhero shows, way more than obviously the last 5 years. If you're not counting like the CW stuff, which is kind of like its own thing, like we're getting like an HBO Max show about the DC universe about John Cena's character, the Peacemaker, and then this. And then you got the success of like Doom Patrol and Titans on HBO Max now. So there's a lot of cool superhero shows. It's kind of cool that we're actually getting into that now within the limited edition. So
All right, so for Brian, my name is Jerome. We will be back next week to talk about Hancock. Thanks for listening.
did you notice Luke Wilson's first line in the movie was "Wow"?